This is the Sternenherz Harmony tool. It's the result of my personal journey through music theory and offers visualizations of music theory that you have not yet seen combined in this way in any other tool. In particular, the Tonnetz that even can be played via touch control, or the still unjustly unknown color tree, which in my case is rather a color pyramid, and can also be displayed and played next to its brother, the circle of fifths. All of its chord buttons can be extended or inverted by these extension settings, and there's even a chord progression chooser, which you have already seen in action at the beginning of this video. By watching this video, you will realize that Sternenherz Harmony isn't trying to replace awesome composing tools like Scalar, but it offers a unique approach to visualizing chord relations while being fully playable via touch control. One of the things I love most is how every part talks to each other. A chord pressed in the circle shows up in the virtual keyboard on the Tonnetz and even sends Midi to your DAW. And vice versa. If you play something on your real keyboard or within your DAW, the incoming chords are detected and translated into their name and their visual representation on the Tonnetz. It's a web of musical logic, made visible and accessible. In this video, I will try to give you a nice overview of it while also diving into the underlying music theory. So beware! Just by watching explanations surrounding this interface, you might already learn some music theory. In case you don't like music theory, you could turn this video off now and buy some MIDI packs or use MIDI generators. If you'd like to turn into a more knowledgeable MIDI generator yourself, then stick around. Before discussing the interface, we have to get the technical things out of the way. So if you don't want to see the technical requirements of how to get this tool running, feel free to skip the next chapter. Just as my audio looper for Bitwig, it's all running inside a software called Touch OSC, which works on PC, Mac, Android, iOS and even Linux. But Linux seems to have some limitations concerning mobile device connectivity. Because for sending MIDI from your tablet to your DAW, you need a helping tool running in the background called TouchOSC Bridge, which receives the data from your tablet and sends it to your DAW. If I remember correctly, TouchOSC Bridge doesn't work natively on Linux, but it seems there is a user-built alternative which you could try. Sternenherz Harmony mainly communicates via Midi, so make sure the Midi connections within Touch OSC and your DAW are properly set up. Personally, I use the tool on my 23-inch touch monitor, which is connected to my Windows PC. So as Touch OSC is running on the same machine, I can either use Touch OSC Bridge or even Loopmidi, which is a tiny program for creating virtual MIDI ports on Windows. For Mac, you go into the IAC driver and add MIDI buses there. There are just a few settings regions which you must know about. In my case, my connection 1 of Touch OSC usually looks like this. Or this. And inside of Bitwig, it looks like that. At least when using a bidirectional script, the link is in the description, which sends all MIDI playback information back to Touch OSC. So the logic behind the connections is pretty straightforward. What comes out of Touch OSC goes through the send port, while MIDI coming to Touch OSC will be received on the receive port. Obviously, this means that inside of Bitwig, the receiving port there needs the send port of Touch OSC, and the send port in Bitwig below connects to the receive port of Touch OSC. For Ableton, all you would have to do is turn on the Loopmidi or Touch OSC Bridge ports in the MIDI settings, and that's it. If you only want chords of a particular track inside Bitwig being detected, one way to do this is just using a one-directional script like the generic keyboard script for receiving MIDI from the tool. And for Bitwig's outgoing MIDI, you load a HW instrument at the beginning of the device chain and select Touch OSC Bridge or any type of virtual MIDI port you have created in the MIDI out section. Just remember, if you want remote control via tablet, then Touch OSC Bridge is mandatory. Also, you would first have to establish a network connection, activate the server function of your TouchOSC desktop program while the Harmony tool is loaded, and connect to it via the mobile TouchOSC. By the way, unlike the desktop version, the app costs a few bucks. After the editor network has been established, you'll see the Harmony tool on your tablet and can save it locally. Now you won't even need the desktop version to run. Because this connection is running over the network, you have to make sure that in the additional Bridge 1 setting inside the mobile app, Bridge 1 is active, which means connected to the TouchOSC Bridge on your PC or Mac. Another hint: by default, TouchOSC starts any template in its editor and not in active play mode. So before any accidental or intentional change to the template, please always keep a copy of the original file. Before we start the full run-through of each function of the tool, let me give you a brief summary about why I built it. Thanks to my mom, playing the piano has been part of my life since I was 3 years old. She introduced me to the classics by Mozart, Beethoven, Bach, but also my most favorite composer, Debussy. I even got to the point that I'm able to compose piano pieces myself. One of them is already uploaded here on YouTube, 5 others are still unpublished. And in my past, I also was a melodic techno producer and created around 50 tracks which I performed live on stage, mainly in Germany and France. The thing is, despite my practical approach to playing and composing music, I'm still lacking a lot of theoretical knowledge which might help express myself even better. Or at least satisfy my curiosity. Nowadays, I really love improvising whatever comes to me in the moment, especially by using the heart piece of my current workflow, my custom-built touch controller for Bitwig, which allows me to live loop and jam with myself, creating whole tracks on the fly. In the last years, I got really curious about some of the more complex chords I'm building without exactly knowing what I'm doing. Oftentimes, I couldn't even name them despite playing them, which of course made it really hard to reproduce certain passages I like to hear again. That's why I really wanted a chord detection display to finally learn their names. Not inside a VST window I have to keep open all the time, but more conveniently, directly inside of my touch interface. Building a chord detection system is a great learning experience in itself. After successfully implementing it into my interface, together with this tiny virtual keyboard which shows the currently pressed notes, I learned so much about chords and modes already that for me it was a very logical step to also dive into the circle of fifths, which then has a great synergy with the chord display. Speaking of the circle, I always loved being able to use it directly inside of Cubase. Ever since changing to Ableton and then Bitwig, I missed such a DAW internal tool very dearly, because I'm a very visual learner and therefore have much less fun with interfaces which look like an Excel sheet. So why didn't I just stick with Scalar or Easy Keys, which both offer a nice circle of fifths? On the one hand, I really liked the idea of having nice touch control. On the other, I already developed my own approach of visualizing the currently selected root note and mode, not only via color highlighting, but also by showing the scale degree Roman numbers on top of the chords. Which is nothing new, of course, but also not something you can show inside Scalar or Easy Keys. So one idea led to the other. Each new visualization of music theory, like the Tonnetz and the color tree. I just had to build them because it's great fun seeing them synergize in one single playable environment. In the end, it got so big that I separated it from my Bitwig interface into a dedicated Harmony tool. My tool doesn't replace the workflow of Scalar, especially its drag and drop style of composing, which I'm personally not so interested in. But it rather offers unique niche features with more music theory visualization and more ways to play around live via touch control, optionally even on a big tablet. But now let's really get into the interface and its underlying music theory. The virtual keyboard, although responding to touch control, obviously isn't really built for that task. In theory, it would be possible to enlarge the keys to increase their playability by editing the template, but its main job is to just show currently pressed notes. The showing of note names above the keyboard can be switched on and off by this toggle button. The Use Flats button changes the name of the black keys from sharps to flats. So a C sharp will get renamed to D flat, and so on. Because I often freestyle, I wanted to have control over when to show flats or sharps. That's why it has to be switched on manually. And that's also the reason why in the intro video you see some wrong chord or note names, because I forgot to switch the flat button on before recording. By the way, if you've always asked yourself why the black keys have two names, the answer might surprise you. It's the alphabet. Well, and also, less surprising, scales. First we have to understand that C sharp and D flat are what we call enharmonic equivalents. What a nice term, right? They have the same pitch and sound exactly the same, but they are written differently depending on the musical context. One important part of the musical context is a scale. A scale is a sequence of musical notes arranged in ascending or descending order of pitch. And each scale has to use a fixed amount of different letter names. Most commonly used scales have 7 letters from A to G. Let's use G major as an example. The G major scale goes like this: G, A, B, C, D, E, F, while the F is an F sharp. Why F sharp and not G flat? Because if we wrote G, A, B, C, D, E, G flat, we would be skipping the letter F. It's as simple as that. Skipping F and having 2 Gs would break the rule of every scale having 1 note per letter. So even though F sharp and G flat sound the same, the correct name in G major is F sharp, because it preserves the alphabetical order. If you don't know much about scales yet, you might ask yourself, why does G major even contain this black key named F sharp? We know this because scales, like the major scale, are built from patterns of whole and half steps. A half step, which you might know as semitone, means moving from key to key on a piano. A whole step obviously consists of 2 half steps, so it's a bigger step, skipping 1 key. Now the major scale has a specific pattern of those steps: whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. When we apply this pattern to a specific starting point on our keyboard, this starting point is then called the key note or the tonic. This note is like the home base of the scale. Now, if we choose C as our key note, our starting point for our major scale pattern, then we got C, D, E, F, G, A, and B. So, obviously, nothing but white keys. But when we start pressing the steps of the major scale with a G, then our major scale pattern tells us that we aren't allowed to play the F, because the spacing between E and F is not a whole step, and therefore would break the rule of our scale pattern. That's why we have to raise the F 1 step higher to the F sharp. You can play around and see how this applies to other keynotes. It's really fascinating. Another very famous pattern of whole and half steps, of course, is the minor scale. But there are even more patterns. These type of scale patterns are called modes. And that's why in my interface, the 2 most important settings are the keynote and the mode. Their current status is shown inside of the display next to the keyboard. And they can be adjusted in several ways. When pressing on that display, you will open up the keynote and mode chooser, which lets you choose all keynotes and a wide variety of modes, which will then affect the scale highlighting on the virtual keyboard, at least if you turn it on by pressing the Show Scales button. A little hint: sometimes the highlighting only starts to show when switching modes or keys. This highlighting obviously is a nice way of visually learning which piano keys are part of each scale. As you can see, the keynote is highlighted the most. By the way, if you're lucky and own a SL-MK3 keyboard, I made the Harmony tool update its LED lights according to the currently chosen mode and keynote. That's nothing new, of course, but it's nice having that automatic switch instead of having to dive into the controller script menus. Now to another important definition in music theory. If we combine the info about which mode we are in with the info about which key note is our home base, then this results in the so-called key. The key is the musical context within which we are using a scale. I know, it might be a bit confusing that a key isn't just a key on a piano. I'm not a big fan of ambiguous terms in the English language, but as you know, if you don't feel confused, you must have been misinformed. The key in which a musical piece is written is its musical context. It tells you what the home note is, the key note or tonic, and what mode for the scale is being used. And all of this will tell you a lot about how chords and melodies relate to the tonic and the whole scale. Let's take a closer look into the most important part of the mode chooser section, which contains the so-called 7 diatonic modes, also known as church or Greek modes. They have a huge influence on our music since many centuries. They include 2 of the most commonly used modes, the major and natural minor mode, or to call them by their Greek name, Ionian and Aeolian. The other ones are Dorian, Phrygian, Lydian, Mixolydian and Locrian. Each of them can be created by starting on a different note of the major scale, resulting in a unique pattern and characteristic sound. When we look at a chart which is based on the C major scale, you remember the scale which only includes white keys, we can see how they are laid out onto the white keys, moving upwards from key to key. So starting with the first mode, the Ionian mode, which is just the major we already know, so we simply got a C major here, but for the second mode, the starting note obviously is a D, so we got D Dorian, which uses all the same white keys as C major, but starting from D, which leads to a different pattern of whole and half steps, giving it a slightly darker, jazzy quality. Next up is E Phrygian, which starts on E. It has a more exotic, tense sound due to that half step right at the beginning. Then comes F Lydian, starting on F. It sounds bright and dreamy due to the raised fourth note. G Mixolydian starts on G and feels major-like, but with a bluesy twist because of the lowered seventh. A Aeolian is just our natural minor scale. It starts on A and has a melancholic, familiar minor feel. Finally, B Locrian, starting on B, is the darkest and most unstable sounding of all the modes, mainly because it begins with a half step and also contains a diminished fifth. Even though all these modes use the exact same notes, the white keys from C to C, each one creates a distinct flavor just by shifting the starting point and thereby the step pattern. Now you might ask yourself, what if we keep the C as the same key note for all modes? How would that look? Then, of course, their difference will not show up by moving across the piano from left to right on the white keys, but rather by also including the usage of black keys. Because, as we already discovered, it's only via sharps or flats that it's possible to maintain specific step patterns of whole and half steps. For a more convenient workflow, those 7 main modes can also be chosen directly via tiny toggle buttons around the circle of fifths, just as the keynotes, which are accessible by sliding this fader here. Choosing different keynotes or any of those 7 main modes will colorize a specific group of notes within the circle of fifths. But before we go deeper into these key groups, let's take a look at the general structure of the circle of fifths. As its name is suggesting, it's built by a sequence of fifths going around in a circle. When moving clockwise around the circle, each note you see is a perfect fifth higher than the previous one. And obviously, counterclockwise, each note is a perfect fifth lower. A very common way of practicing the movement of fifths on the piano is to stay centered around the middle C, to stay within the range of 2 octaves rather than using the full range of the whole keyboard. You will notice that these jumps from note to note don't follow a smooth line, but they zigzag across the keyboard instead, dancing up and down through these intervals. In case you don't know, a fifth is a musical interval. Intervals are like the building blocks of melodies, harmonies, and chords. Unlike chords, which have at least 3 notes, they always consist of 2 different notes. The distance between those notes is what's giving us the name of the interval. For a fifth, the notes are 5 letter names apart, for example going from C to G. When we took a look at the scale pattern structure of modes, we already learned about the 2 smallest possible intervals: half steps and whole steps, or to call them by their interval name, minor second and major second. They are called second because those tiny intervals just include 2 note letters. If you have ever played around on a piano, you might have noticed that pressing a minor or major second doesn't sound too well. It's quite dissonant. And that's the fascinating thing about intervals. Each of them has a unique characteristic sound and can be categorized into a spectrum of dissonance and its opposite, consonance. Now let's check out all the intervals by going up the semitone distance from the keynote C. 1 semitone away from that keynote is the C sharp, forming the minor second. 2 semitones away, the major second. Then we got the minor third, major third, perfect fourth, tritone, and the perfect fifth. Just to be clear concerning the name, although the number 5 is mirrored in the amount of note letters from C to G, a perfect fifth equals the distance of exactly 7 semitones. And feel free to correct me, but it seems the term perfect mainly refers to its special status among the intervals, together with the perfect fourth, which is its inversion. So both fourth and fifth don't have major or minor variants. After the fifth, we got the minor 6. Major 6, minor 7th, major 7th, and the interval almost everybody knows, the octave, which spans 12 semitones from the starting note. Now that we have learned about all the intervals, we can better understand how standard chords are constructed. The most fundamental major and minor chords consist of the so-called basic triad, a root note, a third, and a fifth on top. These are the chords that play when pressing buttons on our circle. And as you may already guess, the difference between major and minor chords lies in the quality of the third. A major chord has a major third, while a minor chord has a minor third, with the fifth typically staying the same. But before we talk more about chords, we still have to find out what's so special about the interval of a fifth. It's really fascinating to realize, but the answer already lies in pressing a single key on the piano. Pressing just one single note isn't really creating an interval. It's called unison, and it's considered the most stable and consonant sound. But don't think a single tone is always just one frequency. On real acoustic instruments, every tone actually contains a whole range of additional frequencies called overtones, forming what's known as the harmonic series. These give the note its richness and character. In contrast, a basic synthesizer tone, like a pure sine wave, contains only the fundamental frequency with no overtones. That's why sine waves sound so clean, but also so plain. But of course we can get overtones too, by using more complex synth sounds with other oscillators or sampled waveforms. The first overtone is the most stable sound right after the unison. And as you can guess, that's the octave, because this interval is playing the same note just with the doubled frequency. And from there, the harmonic series keeps building with other familiar intervals. But our focus will remain with the next one, because right after the octave, we got our perfect fifth. So this is what's so special about the perfect fifth. Its frequency relationship comes closest to this well-sounding consonance of an octave, because it's a wonderful relation of 3:2. This means that when C and G are played together, their sound waves align in a very stable, pleasing way. But this isn't the only reason why the circle of fifths uses fifths as its main elements. Their harmonious relationship is also reflected in the scale overlaps of all notes when moving along the circle, which makes it such a powerful musical tool. Now let's find out together what I mean by scale overlaps. Initially, the circle of fifths was mainly a tool for showing musicians key signatures. Key signatures are the sharps or flats shown at the beginning of a musical staff to indicate which notes should be consistently played sharp or flat. The circle helps musicians find out which key signatures belong to which major and minor keys, showing at a glance how many sharps or flats each key contains. If we look at the outer ring, then moving clockwise adds sharps to the key signature, while moving counterclockwise adds flats. So indeed a very nice tool to find out how many sharps or flats a certain key has. If you're wondering why the circle doesn't show all possible note names for all black keys, but rather just a fixed selection of them, it's because it prioritizes clarity and ease of use. While sometimes the C sharp is still shown as an harmonic equivalent of the D flat, the G sharp and others get left out, because it's very impractical to use more than 7 sharps or flats. Yet another useful application of the circle is being able to see the key signature overlaps between major and minor keys. While the outer ring represents major keys, the inner ring shows their corresponding relative minor keys. So this arrangement shows us that G major, for example, has the exact same amount of sharps like E minor, D major the same as B minor, and so on. And now to the most fascinating thing. By clicking this button in the center, we can add some colors to the outer ring and see the note sequence of each scale, always starting from the tonic. For example, when starting from C, C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. When starting from G, G, A, B, C, D, E, F sharp, G. And so on, going around the full circle. Do you recognize the pattern of 4-note overlaps? These 4-note groups are called tetrachords. The first 4 notes of a scale form its lower tetrachord. The last 4 notes, which include the octave, form its upper tetrachord. As you can see, the whole circle is like a dance of tetrachords, flowing into each other. The upper tetrachord of the C major scale is the lower tetrachord of G major, while the upper tetrachord of G major is the lower tetrachord of D major, and so on. It doesn't matter where we look. If we choose 2 keys which are neighbors on the circle of fifths, their scales are so closely related to each other that their only difference is just one single note. For example, the C major doesn't include the B flat of the F scale, because it uses B natural instead, which it also shares with the G major scale. But the G major scale doesn't have the F of the C major scale, but rather a F sharp which it shares with the D major scale, and so on and so on. This intertwinement of scales means if we compose chord progressions which move along those closely related keys, those transitions will sound very smooth, despite changing keys. At the same time, obviously we can make use of this structure to create stark contrasts by intentionally moving across the circle, jumping into more distant keys. I love how this flow of closely related keys along the circle represents beautiful harmonic movement, but also beautiful movement of colors. The red of the C flows into the a bit more brighter red of the G. The D already includes more orange. Going to the A and the E, it's becoming yellowish green. At the lower half, fully green, and going further along the circle, we also move into the blue and purple and back again to the C. A wonderful flow of colors, not just for fancy looks, but actually representing the movement of closest harmonic relationships. A little side note. Since I was so pleasantly surprised that Bitwig offers the option to colorize notes according to note pitch, which results in the notes being colored along the circle of fifths, I chose to use those exact color values for our circle. Now let's get back to how a selected key is visualized as a highlighted group of 7 circles. Guess what? These circles represent all 7 notes which are part of the specific key you have chosen. They are even numbered from 1 to 7. But instead of using regular digits, we use Roman numerals. Because throughout music history, Roman numbers have been established to show what we call scale degrees. Scale degree Roman numbers not only represent the notes from the tonic 1 upwards to the 7th note 7, they also signify which harmonic function that particular scale degree has on the level of chords. We already know that the outer ring of the circle of fifths contains only major chords like F, C and G, which is why their Roman numerals are all written in uppercase. The inner ring holds minor chords like DM, AM and EM, shown with lowercase Roman numerals and the letter M for minor. And in the innermost ring we find the diminished chord, represented by this tiny superscript circle at his Roman number. Usually those diminished chords aren't shown in a circle of fifths because they are more of a color or a passing chord rather than a tonal center like all of the minor and major buttons. However, I included them to complete the picture and represent all 7 scale degrees: tonic, supertonic, mediant, subdominant, dominant, submediant, and leading tone. When we develop further knowledge and feeling for all scale degrees, just by looking at this highlighted group of chords of C major, we will be able to see how these degrees function harmonically both within the key and across the whole circle of fifths. This is where it gets exciting. Musical storytelling happens through the movement from one chord to another. This is what chord progressions are all about. Each chord represents a scale degree and progressions are the journeys between them. Or to use another picture, chord progressions are like Mario jumping around on the circle of fifths chord buttons. Many well-known progressions even stay within the 7 circles of the selected key, but jumping across different groups into other keys is part of the game too. I highly recommend just playing around with the chords of one group to familiarize yourself with how the transition from certain scale degrees to others sounds. These 7 degrees are like characters in a story, each with their own function, creating tension, release, contrast and color. And once we know how they behave, we can start building progressions that feel natural, emotional or even surprising. One of the most commonly known movements is that from the dominant, the 5, back to the tonic, the 1. Especially if it's the dominant 7 chord, because an added minor 7th creates extra tension, which calls for resolution by going back home to the tonic. There is so much to learn and discover here, so feel free to analyze some of your favorite songs or just watch some of David Bennett's awesome videos about scale degrees. Speaking of awesome, there is a band called Axis of Awesome, and unless you haven't seen it already, their so-called 4-chord song is an absolute must-watch. They are making a very strong and funny point about how many of the greatest hits from the past 40 years just use 4 chords. Or to put it differently, a specific chord progression. Moving from 1 to 5 to 6 to 4. Over and over again. A very good resource to analyze popular chord progressions is hooktheory.com. Right at the beginning of the chord progression page, you'll see the 4-chord song progression used by the Axis of Awesome. And you can scroll through a list of hundreds of songs which use it. Most of the chord progressions you can find there are also included in my own chord progression chooser. So if you click on the Pop Classic 1 progression in my interface, you'll notice that the circle of fifths group gets relabeled. All Roman numbers which aren't relevant get hidden. And on top of the chord names, you will see the progression as numbers going from 1 to 4. So in a way you will be able to paint by numbers. But a more convenient and effective way to play and listen to the chosen progression is pressing the buttons above the progression chooser, simply from left to right. If you want to get rid of the progression numbers inside the circle, just press the reset button. In total, I got about 79 progressions there. The first 36 are a collection of the most popular chord progressions you can also find on Hook Theory or similar sites. The next 17 are picked from Wikipedia's list of chord progressions. And then I added 6 so-called cinematic progressions, 13 jazzy or R&B or house progressions, and a handful of others. A little hint, some of the more complex progressions, which include Roman numbers with sharps, flats or extensions, still have to be considered as experimental, because they might include mislabelings of their Roman numbers. For example, thanks to a YouTube comment by Mr. Amadeus himself, I just recently realized that my cinematic suspense progression, which you can see in the intro video, had a sharp sixth diminished in its Roman number. Actually, it should have been B6, the 6 being uppercase. Since realizing that mislabeling, I fixed it. And let me take this as an opportunity to give you a behind-the-scenes look. This is the progression list inside of the Lua script. For simple mislabelings, the correction is really easy, just replacing that single Roman numeral. In case the system would run into deeper labeling problems for Roman numeral extensions which are too advanced or introduce yet undefined characters, like this half-diminished character, we might have to change some underlying functions, which is more complicated. But since the main goal never was creating a huge archive of advanced progressions with crazy Roman numeral extensions, I'm already really happy now with all the standard progressions for learning purposes. If you're willing to take a deep dive into TouchOSC, the list could get extended by yourself. Another interesting side note concerning progressions which use a dominant chord in minor modes. Let's choose the Pop Classic 2 progression as an example. As you can see, when switching from major to minor, the Roman numbers change from uppercase to lowercase and vice versa. So now, in minor mode, this progression says lowercase 5, which should imply a minor chord being played, right? But the chord labeled inside of the chord progression button and the Roman number inside of the circle of fifths is a major chord. Yet, this isn't really wrong. Let me explain. While writing the chord progression system, I found out that throughout the history of music, the minor dominant, while technically correct in natural minor, was often replaced by a major dominant. Why? Because by doing this, the resolution to the tonic, the return to the tonic, sounds much stronger. So not just contemporary musicians, but also the composers of the Renaissance and later were big fans of a nice drop, even if it meant going out of the pure rules of modal theory and thereby changing the common practice in general. So you can consider my progression buttons partially still showing the old system, both as a relic of the past of music history and as little Easter egg. All chord sending buttons inside the circle or inside the progressions can be changed in their note sending behavior by the middle section of the interface. The velocity can be adjusted with this fader, and with the 2 buttons below, you can change the way the interface sends out notes in general. The first one should be toggled to look like this if you want to send via Midi connection. Otherwise, it's sending via OSC, which requires the drivenbymoss OSC script. The MIDI channel button lets you adjust the active connections of Touch OSC and the MIDI channel. Most importantly, the character of all chords can be significantly changed by these extension buttons. Chord extensions are additional notes added beyond the basic triad. So then it's not just the root, the third and the fifth, but also includes something like the 7th, 9th, 11th or even 13th. Other buttons like augmented, diminished, half diminished, sus2 and sus4 don't extend the chord but alter its basic shape or quality, transforming the triad itself before any extensions are added. Inversions also affect the chord's character by changing which note is in the bass. There are 3 possible inversions of a triad, which you can choose by this inversion slider. They simply describe whether the root, the third or the fifth of the chord is the lowest note, each creating a slightly different harmonic feel. By the way, selecting several extensions at the same time is only possible when switching on the multi-select button. And sorry that I'm not explaining every possible chord extension and combination in detail here. After all, you have to discover some exciting things for yourself. For example, it can be really exciting to pick and choose a specific chord variation and devote some time to research this single chord, its character and its music theoretical background by watching some YouTube videos exclusively dedicated to it, like this video which explains 7 types of 7th chords. Coming back to the metaphor of Mario jumping around on the chord buttons, our inversions and extensions can be seen as power-ups. So when Mario got powered up with a big second inversion mushroom or even a -7 fire flower, making him jump on the buttons is way more exciting and powerful. Speaking of major and minor 7 chords, as I'm a big fan of them, I decided to add a 4th minor 7 button, which you can see here. It will force any minor chord button to play a minor 7 instead of a minor major 7 when the major 7 button is activated. I really wanted that possibility because playing around on the circle is just a lot of fun this way, especially if you invert the basic triad to the second inversion and add an additional root note 1 octave below. I really love that sound. If you're wondering about the buttons called Create Clip, Name Clip and those 5 buttons above, they are specific to Bitwig and they require OSC connection via drivenbymoss script. If you toggle on Create Clip and, very important, have a clip slot of Bitwig selected and in focus, then the next pressed chord button won't play the chord but will start Bitwig's playback, Midi overdub and create a new empty 1-bar clip which should already be named after the chord button. The best thing is to also have the metronome button turned on, because now, when you hear the next first beat count, you can press the chord button again to record this chord into this newly created clip. The Name Clip button is just a handy tool to instantly rename any selected clip to the currently detected chord name. And then we obviously got the overdub button of Bitwig and undo and redo. And if we Bitwig users are lucky, Bitwig 6 might not only offer a scale-aware piano roll, but also proper API access to it, allowing us to link our keynote and mode chooser with Bitwig's setting. That would be awesome. But let's see if that will be possible, or if we will have to write some kind feature request emails. Let's move on to the next big thing of Sternenherz harmony. Pressed chords in the tool or incoming MIDI can also be shown on the Tonnetz. A direct translation of that word would be ToneNet. It's a wonderful visual representation of tonal relationships, which can be seen as lines building up geometrical forms. For example, all major chords are triangles oriented to the right, while all minor chords are triangles oriented to the left. It's so fascinating to study all the different types of forms and their relation to the harmonic sound. By enabling the Press Scales button, you can even see how scales look inside the Tonnetz. Just be aware that changing keynotes takes a while to show up. The Tonnetz was invented by a Swiss mathematician called Leonhard Euler back in the 18th century. The first depiction of the Tonnetz by Euler was this tiny drawing of the tonal relationships. Hugo Riemann, a 19th century music theorist, further developed the concept and was one of the main reasons why it got much more popular. So nowadays you might have come across its most commonly used image. On this image here we can see the underlying structure of the Tonnetz. Going to the left we have a step down by the interval of a perfect fifth, and to the right we have a similar step up. Then we also have steps of minor thirds and major thirds, both up and down. Now for my Tonnetz I went with another, less commonly seen orientation of the whole structure. I simply love it when things which say they go up actually go up, and vice versa. So when you take a look at my Tonnetz and press the info button which shows the underlying logic, you will realize that the intervals of fifths actually are arranged vertically, not horizontally. So a fifth going upwards is really going upwards, and a fifth going downwards is really going downwards. And same with the minor and major third movements. Interesting side note, when we assume enharmonic equivalence of all black keys, the Tonnetz could actually be shown as a torus, because then, by moving far enough, it's wrapping into itself. Speaking of fascinating geometrical forms, when we wouldn't use equal temperament tuning, the circle of fifths wouldn't actually be a circle, but a spiral. But this topic is a bit too much for now, so let's get back to the Tonnetz. The Tonnetz can also be used to show harmonic relationships between triads. There are three key transformations: P, L and R. P for parallel switches a major triad to its parallel minor, for example C major to C minor, and vice versa. The L, which stands for Leittonwechsel, leading tone exchange, replaces the root with the leading tone. So when switching from C major to E minor, the root of C gets replaced with a B. And then there's the R, a relative shift between relative major and minor chords, like from C major to A minor. These transformations connect triads through minimal voice leading, which means one note changes, helping composers explore smooth, expressive harmonic progressions. But it's also really interesting to analyze shifts in tonal color across musical pieces on the Tonnetz. And I highly recommend watching the whole series of Riemannian transformation videos by Franz Absil. Enabling the circle color button is a nice additional way to see which notes are currently played inside the circle. So in this case, the highlighted circle buttons don't represent chords, but just their single note letters. You could also get your hands on the Tonnetz literally and play it yourself. Because in play mode, it sends out Midi to your DAW. Playing the Tonnetz can be a quite fun way to understand it more deeply. It isn't necessarily a good way to make music or to compose just by playing it, but it is a fun way to learn, especially by playing your favorite synths or favorite VST instruments. Just a little disclaimer, as I'm using the interface on touch monitors which are at least 22 inches big, you might find playing the Tonnetz a bit fiddly on smaller tablets. Maybe I will create a pure Tonnetz template in the future where it is at least stretched to fill the full screen. Another technical limitation which has to be mentioned about the Tonnetz is that when it is not in play mode, but just opened to show any incoming MIDI or pressed chords, you might experience a little bit of lag or latency on the interface. That is due to the sheer amount of scripting information running in the background and especially the huge amount of box widgets which are necessary for the visual feedback of the Tonnetz. So in case you have very old hardware, this might be a technical limitation, and I'm sorry about this, but it is beyond my ability to fix as of right now. So if you want to play in a chord progression without any latency with the interface, just temporarily close the Tonnetz or turn it into play mode. There is yet another nice way to explore the world of chords I haven't talked about yet. You can open it with this table view button. It's like a zoomed-in representation of a group inside of the circle of fifths, which, depending on your chosen keynote and mode, lets you play across a wide selection of chord variants for each of the 7 Roman numbers of a circle group. I really had to do this table view because despite being able to extend the chords of the circle via the chord extension section, this only lets you play one set of fixed chord variants at a time for all buttons, as we have already seen with our major 7 example. So I also wanted to have this table view because it lays out in front of you many more chord variants which you can immediately play around with without having to juggle around extension buttons. And now to the final big thing of this Sternenherz harmony tool. Lo and behold, here is a tone color pyramid. To me, it seems like this is still only known to some music theory fans on Reddit, and that should change. Because it's such a lovely and very logical way of depicting intervals and chords while going along the circle of fifths counterclockwise, clockwise and both. These movements are what's filling up the pyramid with color, from top to bottom. Let's take a look at the first block. We are starting with the keynote there, which means 0 movement on the circle of fifths. Hence the -0 and +0 numbers. And then, by adding or subtracting an interval movement of a perfect fifth, we go down. So the second row consists of 2 intervals of a perfect fifth. The left block represents F and C, because on the circle it went a step to the left, represented by -1. The other block is C and G, because it says -0 and +1, which means +1 step to the right on the circle of fifth. In the third row, we already got 3 different chords. The one in the middle being a special one because it represents a movement which goes both ways along the circle, clockwise 1 step to the right and counterclockwise 1 step to the left, and thus including F, C and G. While the left chord includes B flat F C and the right chord C G D. This principle of adding steps in specific directions goes a long way, as you can see. Going down the pyramid, we get more and more complex chords, and it's really fascinating to study each row in detail. Especially the 7th row, because it's actually representing our 7 main modes. In the end, we finally reach a full circle, literally, because the circle is filled up with notes, which is the chromatic scale. So pressing any of those buttons in the base of the pyramid obviously won't sound that well, as it's just pressing down all 12 notes of the circle. I first came across this concept by a Reddit post from Andrew Sharon, who even built a whole dedicated webpage for what he calls the color tree. You can check out his YouTube videos about it. He seems like a really nice guy. So shout out to him, great thing he shared this discovery and made it more popular. The reason why it's a color pyramid in my case is simple. I'm not a big fan of upside down pyramids, but also I really loved to synchronize the movement along the circle with the actual structure. Another concept which I didn't include is naming the left side dark and the right side light. Of course, it makes sense to recognize that the whole structure has a clear axis in the middle. But I personally think there are far too many harmonical colors audible on each side for a definite split into light and dark. Hence my more colorful approach, not using black and white. Getting your hands on music theory and playing with its visual representations never has been combined in such a way. At least I haven't seen any other tool like it. As a piano teacher, I think this tool is really helpful for showing students how chords relate in an interactive manner. It bridges theory and practice in real time, so a really helpful visual learning companion. So I'm quite happy with my tool and hope you will be too. You can get it now on my Patreon. The cheapest variant is just supporting me for 1 month and then cancelling. The other option is to directly buy the post, which includes the file. I would love to share everything for free, but it took me so many months of dedicated work, and also, who doesn't need some money in this economical situation? Thank you so much for your support, especially to the looper people who already enjoy my Bitwig audio looper. It's really having a positive impact on my life. One last comment about music and music theory. In order to make soul-touching music, you really don't need any theory beyond knowing how to play an instrument or sing. A bit of practice with an instrument and your own self-allowance to express yourself and your feelings freely, and that's it. At least in my opinion. But music theory can be a really inspiring adventure to dive into. Part of that adventure is finding out that despite being optional, it can definitely enrich your way of expressing yourself. A little paradox, I know. Keep on making music. Have a nice day. Goodbye.